Greetings and welcome to the latest edition of the Entheogenic Evolution podcast. As always, I'm your host Martin, and I'm happy to have you with me today. For this week's episode, my guest is Ashley Booth. Returning to the Entheogenic Evolution podcast after many, many years, I interviewed her quite some time ago on the podcast, which, I've been doing for 17 years now, so I'm not sure when it was, but it was a long time ago. But Ashley has a brand new book out, and it is called Quieting the Storm Within, an illustrated introduction to your parts through internal family systems and beyond. Thought it would be a nice tie-in with our previous episode of Ayahuasca Inside Out, which is taking the same idea of internal family systems and then putting it into a play and musical about ayahuasca. And Ashley is trained as a psychedelic therapist, and she is here to talk about how this works in the context of psychedelic therapy and integration work. And the book itself is not really about psychedelics in any way, shape, or form, but that is her profession and career, and she is obviously well qualified in applying it to work with psychedelics. So it's great to have Ashley back on the show. We'll get to that in just a second. And just a reminder for you, if you want to check her out online, we have ashleybooth.net and ifsandbeyond.com are her two websites, and links for those will be available in the podcast notes. Okay, before we get into the conversation with Ashley, just a few things. First off, congratulations to Stephen Kirby, the director of the Mindscape Psychedelic Institute. After several months of back and forth between the two of us with editing and adding and changing and shifting around, we finally have produced the final copy of the Trauma-Informed 5-MeO DMT Facilitation and Educational Manual book that comes out of the text that he and I both wrote for the 5-MeO facilitation course with Mindscape Institute. And we have now turned it into a book. A lot has been added to it. It's shifted and changed quite a bit from the text that was written for the class. All of those original materials are in there, but many areas have been added to it. It's been expanded upon. And then also one of the things that we did in creating the book was I had contributed a number of things into the original text. And because this was Kirby's book, what we did is, he took the things that I wrote and then he put it more into his own perspective and his own voice. And it's a nice, clean work. It does not take the place of actually getting trained to work with 5-MeO DMT and facilitate for others, but it is a great manual. It is going to be a fantastic resource for people. And that is out and available now. It's on Amazon and paperback and also via Kindle. And I was very happy to write the foreword for the book and also serve as the editor and kind of book Sherpa. I designed the cover, did all the formatting, did all of that, and it is out now. Going to be bringing Kirby on to the podcast sometime soon. We haven't set up a day or time yet, but I do want to interview him about the book and talk about it here on the podcast. Also, speaking of Mindscape Psychedelic Institute, I just want to give a shout out to my students who have been in the 5-MeO DMT Integration Specialist training course that I've been teaching over the past couple of months. Coming up on Wednesday is our 9th and final class. We have actually reached the end of the term, the end of the class, and I just want to give a shout out to all of those students. It has been an absolute pleasure for me to teach this class. I've really, really, really enjoyed it tremendously. I'm going to miss it when it's gone. I have not yet selected dates for when I'm going to teach the course again, but I am going to be teaching it at some point later this year. I need to look at my calendar and, look at all the scheduled stuff, with my son and, other things that are happening in my life. But I will be teaching it at some point, and I, of course, will let you know here on the podcast. You can always check out the courses at mindscapeinstitute.org if you want more information there. And I will post information about the class on my integration website, non-dualentheogenicintegration.com, which, of course, to remind you, I'm always available for 30, 60, or 90-minute integration video calls helping you prepare for, navigate, and integrate your entheogenic experience from a non-dual and energetic perspective. I specialize in 5-MeO DMT experiences, but of course I'm not limited to that, and I'm happy to talk to you about any of your psychedelic experiences or just about non-dual experiences, awakening and transformation in general, as you need and as you like. Lots more great interviews are already scheduled for this podcast. Actually, over the next 2 weeks, I think I have like 4 interviews lined up. So there's lots happening, and I'll let you know as those are on their way. And I think that's about it that I have for today. Of course, if you want to reach out and get in contact with me, stop by martinball.net or shoot me an email at martinwball@gmail.com. Set up a consultation if you like. And just a reminder, if you'd like to support this podcast and get something back in return, then I invite you to stop by my Patreon page at patreon.com/martinwball and sign up at the level that is comfortable for you and with the benefits and gifts and bonuses that you would like to receive. And there's no obligation. You can change it anytime. Okay, let's get into our conversation with Ashley Booth. And a reminder again about our websites, ashleybooth.net and ifsandbeyond.com. Her book is Quieting the Storm Within. Here's our conversation. Hope you enjoy. Yeah, so how are you doing?
It's been a wild few years, as I think it has been for all of us.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, changing careers, navigating craziness of COVID and the ongoing craziness of the world, and where I fit into the whole thing. So, I don't know.
Well, I'm excited to talk to you today. Are you ready to just jump in? Because I don't want to like talk about all kinds of cool stuff before we officially start. Okay.
Yeah.
So we're now starting. Okay, I am welcoming back onto the Entheogenic Evolution podcast today, Ashley Booth, and it has been a number of years since Ashley has been on the podcast. So actually, we are kind of continuing with the theme where I've been inviting people back onto the podcast who were here years ago, but might be new to my current listening audience. So we have several objectives today, Ashley. One is we want to just reintroduce you to the podcast audience, because with you, was it maybe 10 years ago that I interviewed you? I don't
Possibly.
even. It was a long time ago.
Time flies.
Yeah. So who knows who is listening today, who was listening back then. So we're going to reintroduce you. Then we're going to talk about your new book, which is about internal family systems. And we're going to be discussing just what that is for anybody who doesn't know. And then sort of the third part, because this has been coming up a lot in my integration work with clients. For clients tell me, yeah, I'm working with internal family systems to help integrate my psychedelic experience. So then we want to get to sort of the application of how that fits in the world, sort of the still developing world of psychedelic integration, and what you understand that to mean and how it applies, and the advice that you would give for people who are applying it for themselves. So that's our objectives for today. So first, just welcome back, Ashley. It's great to see you.
Thank you. It's good to see you too.
Yeah. So are you still down in the LA area?
Yes. Yeah. I live about an hour outside of LA.
So were you in any of the areas that got hit with the fires?
No, I wasn't, but I had several clients that either they lost their homes or a family member lost their home. So it was a wild time to be a therapist in that context. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that you yourself were not inundated with, the fires and all that, but certainly I'm sure impacted a lot of people down there. And, I've just been thinking in general that probably the whole population of the United States and maybe even the world, like amounts of trauma are probably just rising and rising with everything that's going on.
Yeah. Well, I think, we can continue to talk about this, but, trauma is not new to humanity, but the way that we're not able to handle trauma and all the ways that we've been resilient in the past are, we've weeded out in many ways. And so I think that's why more people have problems with it.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So you're still down in LA. Are you still running the Aware Project, or is that now part of the past?
The Aware Project was a Southern California Psychedelic Society that I started, over 10 years ago now. And the LA chapter, we didn't reopen since COVID, but the San Diego chapter is still going strong. So we're still going.
Okay. Well, let's Well, maybe we need to back up further then. It says let's get a little bit of your biography. I believe didn't you work at Crossroads before the Aware Project? Am I remembering correctly?
Yeah, that was way back. Yeah, I
Okay.
can give a general bio of who I am and how I fit
Yeah.
into the psychedelic community. Um, yeah, so let's see. Had some very big, powerful experiences that I think we spoke about the first time
Yeah.
that I was on the podcast. So we can talk about that again if we need to. But that inspired me to start the Southern California Psychedelic Society, the Aware Project, back in 2014, I think it was. And that spun out into monthly. I think we hosted over like 90 events, or I hosted personally over 90 events over a number of years, and through that got connected to MAPS, and they encouraged me to apply for one of the jobs that was going to be coming up for one of the LA clinical trial sites for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. So I applied, and because of my science background, I used to be an oceanographer. Um, I was hired as the study coordinator for the LA clinical trial, and was able to have the encouragement of the team to go back to school and get my licensure to become a therapist. And so I went back to school, did that for several years, and then was able to join them on the clinical trial. And I believe I was the only pre-licensed clinician on the whole MDMA clinical trial, so that was a real honor. And so I did that until the trial closed. And yeah, so then I started doing ketamine work. So I now I do ketamine-assisted psychotherapy, a lot of psychedelic integration work. I've written a book, which we'll talk about later,
Yeah.
and I've got a private practice that I run these days. And I've been doing some ketamine-assisted psychotherapy trainings, and I really enjoy teaching. So that's been a really fun new thing recently. So
Great.
I think that's mostly getting us up to date.
Yeah. So this isn't something that we talked about talking about, but since you mentioned working with MAPS, I'm just curious if you are interested to
Mhm.
share with us what are your thoughts on what happened with the approval process for MDMA assisted therapy and what happened with Lycos. And
Sure.
I've seen Hamilton Morris kind of picking apart some of what he alleges is just the blatantly false information that was entered by Symposia into the
Sure.
record. I'm just curious, like, what are your thoughts on what happened there? Like, and then there was, I think it was a New York Times article that said this group has sabotaged legal psychedelic therapy, of
Yeah.
course, in reference to Symposia, which,
Yeah.
as I'm sure you know, I do not have a happy history with personally.
Sure. Yeah,
But
I
yeah,
remember that.
what are your thoughts on that?
Um, such a loaded question.
Yeah.
Um,
You don't
so
have to answer if you don't want
no,
to.
no, no,
You
it's
can
okay.
say,
It's okay.
different topic, please.
That's okay. Um, yeah, I think maybe without getting too much into the weeds, what became clear to me is that we haven't educated. So it means so many of the people that advised the FDA on whether they should get approved were not well educated on the ins and outs of the clinical trial. And watching them talk to each other, it was like they were just spitting out and like regurgitating something else that somebody else had said. They're like, "Oh yeah, that's on functional blinding. That it's and then they would just kind of keep repeating it, and it was like, did you even read and look at the data? It seemed like they were just bouncing it back and forth, and so that was really frustrating. And so I think there's a lot more education that needs to happen. And so, to a certain extent, I can see why maybe we aren't ready yet to be able to implement this. Like, if that was the higher ups of the different organizations that are supposed to be representative of the field aren't able to like comprehend what it is that we're trying to
Hmm.
do, maybe we're not ready because I'm I pride myself on being a good psychedelic assisted psychotherapist, but if we can't train and like support systems to be able to understand how to hold this in a proper way, then maybe we're not ready to roll it out, as sad as that might be. And so I'm still taking sort of a long view of this because I know that psychedelics are just going to continue to integrate into our society. That is a foregone conclusion to me, and it's just a matter of time. And so I try to step back and just recognize that we're going through such an awkward adolescent phase in the development of our human evolution. And this is just the stage that we're at. And so while it is sad for the people that aren't going to be able to get access to these things, I I trust in God's timing and I trust in the evolution of what's happening. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and take this opportunity just to make some clarifications and distinctions because you are a licensed therapist working with ketamine. You have gone through the trainings and the protocols and all of that. And this is one of these areas that's a little bit nebulous and that maybe some people don't understand all of the distinctions. So like up here in Oregon, as I'm sure you're aware, we have the psilocybin program. But that's not therapy because those aren't therapists, those are facilitators. So I've had people on to kind of talk about these nuances and differences. So I would just like to invite you to help clarify some of these distinctions and what is the difference between a psychedelic assisted therapist or therapy versus like the psilocybin program. And of course, ketamine is in a different category. It's Schedule 2, it's not Schedule 1. And so if you would, as someone who is a professional in this area, help bring a little clarity, if you would, please.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think the most important thing is to recognize that for psychotherapy, you need to be able to sort of diagnose someone with with something. And so otherwise I'm maybe using psychotherapeutic kind of tools, but you're maybe just doing more coaching. And so that might be an important distinction to be able to point out to people. So for me to prescribe someone, or I'm not actually doing the prescribing, I have to refer someone else to a prescriber to get them prescribed ketamine. So, but both me and the prescriber have to diagnose the person with something that ketamine has been shown to be helpful in improving. So depression, OCD, anxiety, PTSD. Whereas the people that are maybe these facilitators, right, in Oregon, things are coming up in Colorado, they're not treating a condition because that starts to bump it up against the issues of like, if you're trying to treat depression and you don't have the qualifications to be able to do that, nor is the FDA given proper. The FDA hasn't. Nobody has shown that either MDMA or psilocybin is safe and effective, and I'm making air quotes as I say this for people that are just listening, safe and effective for the treatment of some condition. So I think it's important to note that our medical system is based on a pathologized. We pathologize people and we have to give them a label. So I can't, which is really funny. And when I started getting into this work, it was so funny to me that I couldn't, that in the future when we have MDMA assisted psychotherapy, I can't prescribe MDMA assisted psychotherapy for couples because marriage conflict is not in the DSM.
Right.
It's not in the manual of diagnoses of what is a potential thing that we can diagnose and then treat it. So there's just all these really subtle nuances that, if you're not in the field, it's definitely confusing. But I also, at the same time, all of the things that are going on in Oregon are challenging the status quo and pushing the boundaries of what it means to be able to either facilitate these kinds of things or what is treatment or what is being able to just receive a drug without needing to be treating something.
Yeah.
So real, yeah.
So kind of as a related but more of a side issue, I've read a few articles that kind of lamented the fact that therapy speak has become rather ubiquitous just within culture. And I think somebody
Sure.
like created a parody where
Sure.
every character, like every line of their dialogue was like referencing some kind of therapeutic, like, oh, that's
Sure.
my trigger word, or I need a safe
Mm-hmm.
space, or
Mm-hmm.
you're activating my, trauma or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. And so they're having these whole dialogues and everything is trauma speak.
Mm-hmm.
Everything is therapy speak. So I think one argument on the plus side is, well, people are becoming more aware, and so they have more self-awareness and maybe more autonomy over how they're able to navigate social relationships. But then the negative side is, well, then it turns everything into trauma, turns everything into therapy. I'm curious if you have, as a professional therapist, do you have any thoughts on sort of this language getting used outside of that? And so then the relationship is that we do see a lot of this brought up in psychedelic sessions and ceremonies where people are using these therapeutic words, but not necessarily trained within these disciplines. So it's kind of a broad spectrum of issues, but I'm curious in your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think what it's showing is that we lack a vocabulary to be able to talk about our internal world.
Mm,
And whether that be a spiritual language or a psychological language, we're needing more words to be able to and conceptualizations on how to map what it is that's going on inside of us. And so I think we're just kind of, again, we're in a phase right now where we're incorporating these new things, but we're not necessarily at an ending point. And so what I tell people, and when I'm working with people around trauma, is I say, the trauma is not the end. The trauma is a stage that you're in, and then you need to progress it, continue the story of what happens past the trauma. Who are you becoming? Who are you? What are you declaring yourself to be in response to this trauma? And so I think pop culture and pop psychology is just sort of lagging a little bit, but at least, so I don't have a huge problem with it because I see it in a bigger context. And I think that the nuances that will continue to come up needed this as a framework and a groundwork first. And so I think we need to, right now, we're in a kind of a gestalt of acknowledging that there's a lot of things that we have experienced or how people treat us or how we treat ourselves that are traumatic. And then we shouldn't just brush them under the rug. And so we have to kind of highlight them and acknowledge that they're there first. And then afterwards, we're going to be able to start to move into a different phase. And so I think there's just a collective thing, whereas with an individual, people are doing the same arc on their own, but we're also collectively doing it.
Yeah, I do appreciate that we're in a very different place. Just I've shared this a few times on the podcast of when speaking with therapists and people dealing with trauma and things like that, where back in 2015, I was interviewed by this guy who had this radio program up in Canada, and I guess he's kind of popular up there. But I didn't know anything about his show, and he had me on, and he identified as a former cop, and was just completely adversarial around the idea of using psychedelics for any form of therapy or overcoming trauma. And he's like, well, when I was young, we just sucked it up, and
Right.
I was kind of blown away because I was like, well, why are you even having me on your podcast? And well, it wasn't a podcast, it was a radio show. And obviously it was just so he could argue with me and he could belittle the position that we could use these substances to actually help people who have experienced some kind of trauma. So I guess on the other end of that, it's kind of nice that, well, people are using these terms, are using this language. There is more awareness. And then there's a lot more awareness around the potential of how psychedelics might play a role within treating these things. So, yeah, the pendulum swings, I suppose.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I've been personally chewing on recently is how much, and we'll talk about it more when we talked about IFS, but how much are we nurturing the parts of us that have been wounded, but then also, so there needs to be acknowledgement, but then also cultivating and making space for courage and resilience and these other things to be able to come through, which I think he's kind of speaking to, but it's like he's bypassed it, right? We just sucked it up and we had courage, or we just moved on, right? And so, yes, we do want to get to that, but it's bypassing the pain, and we're wanting to be able to now acknowledge what's there so that we're creating a kinder world and a more sensitive world. Because if we have more sensitive people that don't want to hurt each other, then there's going to be less pain in the world, you know? But if we've just bypassed all the pain, then it's still in us, and we just tend to perpetuate making more pain around us.
Yeah. So that sounds like a good transition into, now let's talk about what is IFS, internal family systems. And let's just go ahead and assume that nobody in the audience knows what in the world it is, though I'm sure many of them do. Let's start there. And I'm even curious just about the history of sort of this therapeutic modality, where it comes from. Certainly, I've been hearing a lot about it in really just the past few years. It just comes up a lot with people. So yeah, let's start with that.
So the analogy that I start in with the book at the very beginning, which illustrates the point very beautifully, is that we all have different voices in our heads. So a glib example is, I want to eat that donut. And then another voice in my head says, don't eat the donut, it's unhealthy for you. Right? So everyone can relate to having conflicting voices in their heads, right? Conflicting perspectives. And so what Richard Schwartz, who's the founder and sort of, I would call him a discoverer of this modality, recognizes that when he actually started to treat each of those different perspectives almost as if their own separate subpersonality, and start asking them questions and being curious about them, like, hey, when did you start, believing this, that donuts are bad for you? And when did you learn how to react that way? Then we start to see that they all have their own like little stories. And what he kind of found, because he was a family systems therapist, what he found was that the voices and the different perspectives in the people's heads interacted kind of like a family. And so he called it internal family systems. And so it's like we all have this little internal family of all these different voices that have their own behaviors, that have their own desires. And when we can acknowledge that that our minds are actually naturally a multiplicity, it provides a lot more spaciousness to be able to speak for our needs and speak for our conflictions, and normalize when people feel in a way that's conflicted.
So let me pause you there just a moment, because I want to make sure that I'm understanding this correctly. So it sounds like this individual, did you say his name is Andrew?
Oh, Richard.
Richard. Dick. I just made that up. Yeah, I just totally made that up. Okay, Richard. Sorry. So it sounds like there was an quote unquote external family systems. We're looking at family dynamics, and I think maybe they're like, I'm just going to, okay, this person is the black sheep of the family. That's the favorite child. That one's the rebel. That one's the protector. That one's the provider. That one's the, political oddball or whatever it may be. And so that through these dynamics that then people are creating their own self-identities and having their issues with family. So he basically internalized that and looking at how these similar kinds of dynamics that we're seeing on the outside are actually playing out on the inside through this idea of the multiplicity of the self that is interacting with these different parts of the self and also with different situations within the world. Okay.
Yeah. And so from an IFS perspective, we don't use the word ego, but we might say that the ego is made up of several different subpersonalities or different parts. And so that's the language that we use in IFS, is that we talk about each of them, those subpersonalities, as parts, because it makes it easy to talk about, like, a part of me wanted to eat the donut, a part of me didn't want to eat the donut. And that's kind of you can speak naturally that way using that language.
Yeah. So something I'm curious about, because it's mentioned in the book. And actually, just what's the title of the book?
Yeah, it's the whole title is Quieting the Storm Within, an illustrated introduction to your parts through internal family systems and beyond.
Okay.
And then I just got the book the other day, so I'm showing it to Martin right now. So
Nice.
so I'm excited to have it in person.
Yeah, and I've had a chance to read through the PDF version of the book. So one of the things that comes up in the book is when we're talking to these different parts of this idea of like, where do you feel that in your body? So here I want to go on a little bit of a side tangent because this is kind of similar in a way to what I like to call non-dual energetic analysis with people. So this is something that I do with my integration clients is that we look at how kind of this similar idea that the ego, the self, is actually made of many different potential characters. And one of the things that I like to help my clients do is identify when they're in a different character that actually a lot of times it changes their voice and it changes the body language that they use. And so this is an experience that I'm sure lots of people, well, maybe not so much anymore because people don't talk on the phone anymore. Everybody just texts. But you can do these experiments where you can, if somebody that you know well, you can just listen to their part of a conversation on a phone call, and you can probably identify either who they're speaking to or what category of person they're speaking to because their vocal register will change, the words that they use change, and then also, again, how their body language is then mobilized as they're talking on the phone will be different if they're talking to their mom or their boss or their child or their lover. So I'm curious about sort of this somatic nature of this idea of internal family systems and how that interacts with our embodied sense of being and expression, not just the internal voices, but how we're actually externalizing and expressing that. Turning it over to you.
Yeah, I think I've been conceptualizing that as that we have different neural networks that are associated with each of these different parts. When we're in IFS language, we say that we're blended with a part. With when one of them is basically driving the bus of who we are, and we're showing up as that part. And so it seems like there are these discrete not just a mindset, but also a whole physical body, because different parts also come from different ages and they tend to be trapped at different ages. And so when I'm interacting with certain people in my life, I might regress to a younger aged part of me because that's the one that I have when I'm in a dynamic with that person. And in other ones, I may have a different age. And so that comes with its own host of sort of behaviors and mannerisms. That's pretty cool.
So let's talk about then the development of these different parts, because you just mentioned that they come from different ages and different stages, but they might get locked within that particular time period of how they were generated. And then I'm also, you've mentioned this now, not using the word ego, but still the sense that there's these parts that we blend with. So then that's the question. I know this is in the book, so this is why I'm asking you, like, what is it blending with? Like if I'm picking, okay, this is my petulant child self that I'm now performing through and as. It's blended with myself, but then when I remove that, well then what the hell am I? Like if I'm not these different parts that I'm blending with and I'm decoupling from, then what am I?
Right.
And so yeah.
Right. And so that's what Dick Schwartz had the same question. And what he started to do is he started to ask and help the parts feel safe enough to unblend and move to the side. And eventually, what he found was that when people unblended, eventually they got to a point where they're like, that's just me. And what he found and what he called that core essence is he called that a self with a capital S. And what he found was that people that whenever he got them to unblend down into that self quality, they had several people tended to show similar qualities. So there was something about the essence of that selfhood that was similar. And so he came up with 8 C words. We called them the 8 C's. I'll just name a few. But compassion, calm, curiosity, courage, creativity. So these are all things that he was noticing are a quality of that deeper sense of self. And that seems to kind of map onto other spiritual traditions that have a different views, maybe not Buddhist so much, but other types of religions where you're getting to sort of a core, for lack of a better word, like a soul or like some sort of essence. And so I like to think of it as like the seat of consciousness, and then the parts kind of jump in as sort of like our personalities or humanness. And so one of the things that I did in this book that I didn't see too many other people do is that I wanted to really show that the parts were really about they're advocates for our core human needs. And so they are kind of the framework that we use to be able to navigate this human plane of existence. And yet also at the same time, we have this self that's deeper down that has these kind of more spiritual qualities to it. And so we are this multifaceted being, but we need the parts inside of us to be able to navigate all the relationships, the environment, and making sure that we don't, do something that could harm ourselves. And so they are either letting us know, hey, you're hungry, or hey, you need a little more social, I'm going to tell you that you're lonely because you need to have some more social interactions, right? Or these are just different core needs that we have as humans. And so it's important. So that's what's really important about listening to our parts, is that we're not necessarily trying to get rid of them per se, but we're trying to understand why, what it is that they're advocating for. And then how do we help meet that need in possibly a better way than they have been? Because sometimes our parts will make us try to feel better by eating a whole bunch of donuts, but that's not really best for our long-term interests.
Right. So it kind of sounds like within this model that these different parts of the self, or these different characters that we're taking on and performing through, that they're not necessarily being described here as either good or bad, but that they arise in response to various needs and desires, and that they can be in service of maybe these core essence features of the self, or, and this is where therapy comes in, they can become dysfunctional. We can become trapped in them and be trapped in patterns that actually, even though they come from a place of needing to exert protection or to achieve something, that maybe they're actually working against us in some way, so that there are positive and negative aspects to it. And just to maybe compare it to, you mentioned like spiritual traditions, like what I see is different, why this is, quote, therapy versus spiritual traditions, that a lot of the spiritual traditions that say that, yes, we have these different desires and needs of the self, and we just want to transcend beyond all that shit and just fucking wipe it out so that we can just reside in the ultimate nature of the self. And then that is characterized as now liberation, that now you don't have to deal with reality anymore because you've discovered the true self. And so now you can just meditate away until, everything goes to oblivion. And that, of course, is not the purpose of therapy. That therapy is for integration and functionality within families, within the job, within society, within the social sphere, so that this allows a route for embracing that. So,
well, and what I'd say too is just that I guess one of the things that drew me to this modality is that it very much supported what I had already, a conceptualization of myself and what we're doing here on this planet in these bodies, that fit with my own psychedelic experiences, and that being able to connect with a non-dual space, a place of compassion and love is what I've experienced, and that the seed inside of myself, of my own self with a capital S, has similar qualities. And in my first experience that we talked about many years ago was that this life is a gift, and to be able to be in it. And we're always going to return back up into that place of once we die, or after we went through whatever it is, but we're going to be returning back to that place of that non-dual fullness. at some point. And right now we're experiencing what it's like to be in a body. And so play the game is how I've viewed it. And so I see this as a really helpful framework on how to understand and play the game.
Yeah. So since you mentioned it, yeah, let's talk about how does this work then in conjunction with psychedelic experiences? And I'm even wondering if you see potential limits in the model, or do you see it could apply here? For example, what just coming to mind is, so like on 5-MeO, sometimes people go into these deeply embodied energetic states where maybe they're growling around like an animal, and then afterwards they might not even know they did that if they see a video like, well, I don't know what that was. Like we can't really ask if what part was that, but it seems very animalistic. And then of course, when we get into things like DMT experiences and people are having conversations with aliens and machine elves, like what part of that? Like, is there a limit? Does it break down, or can it encompass these more liminal kinds of experiences, and just how does it apply in general? So
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say that it necessarily explains per se those transpersonal experiences or those somatic energetic releasing experiences. There is a whole part of IFS that's really based more around somatics. And so I think that there is a place for IFS to kind of be curious about, to be able to use the IFS framework to be curious about, like, well, I don't know, make those growling noises again. What does that feel like, right? What is there a need inside of you, right? Because we're essentially just trying to understand what the needs are. And maybe there was a need to be able to express oneself or to move, or I don't know, it could be anything. So what I use IFS for really is preparing people to kind of understand where their blocks are and their belief systems, and their patterns of doing things, because having a general framework around that helps them on the integration process and helps them through many journeys too, because and depending on what psychedelics you're using, right? For MDMA, IFS is fantastic, and we've seen in the clinical trials that the people doing IFS, the participants, just kind of spontaneously started speaking about parts and themselves, not maybe in the exact same language, but they were speaking to the same framework. So that feels very confirming because it sort of arose independently. And so those are really great medicines to be able to work with IFS. When you start to getting to more kind of DMT or 5-MeO DMT, you're getting more into the transpersonal realm. And so I think the IFS that's helpful in that case is, how are all of the person's parts responding to that experience that they just had? It may not explain what the experience is, but they have a whole bunch of human parts that are going to be either freaking out about it, loving it, spiritually bypassing around it, any number of things. And so that's going to be a really important language to be able to use, to be able to help them, just help all those parts of them integrate, because each part kind of needs to be able to integrate an experience like that to a certain extent. And so if you can speak to that, then people have some language around it.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting distinction, to kind of acknowledge that, well, maybe there are limits to the model when we get into this transpersonal stuff. But when you come back down to embodied everyday consciousness and reality, this is how the human self and mind is going to start processing this material and this information. That it's not just landing on a blank slate, it's landing on someone who has cultivated these different personality traits or sub-personalities and behavioral and thought patterns and expressive patterns. So that's the mix it's going to go through, right? Regardless of how transpersonal it might have been. So, yeah. Let's return to the point, I don't think we really got into this, about the somatic inquiry that's related to, so it comes up in the book with the idea of, well, when you have this thought, the thought that says, come on, fatty, don't eat another donut, there's the somatic inquiry about, well, where do you feel that in your body? How does that process work? And as an inquiring process, how does that people uncover what's going on?
Right, because it is a whole neural network that is participating in each of these parts, we can trace back, because what we're trying to do is help people get into that nervous system state. The whole, like, we want them to embody that part fully and understand how does it help them, like, how do they participate in their body, right? Maybe their shoulders go forward, or they start to contract their stomach, or their throat gets tense, right? We're seeing areas of how they are talking, how it's communicating, right? Even without words, that the part that I just sort of described there might be like bracing against something or holding something back. And so we get to learn more about that part through how it participates in the body. And it also can be a great window to start to talk to parts, because people aren't used to using that. I can say, okay, so you're feeling that tightness in your throat. If your throat could say something right now, what would it want to say? Or what does it not want you to say by clamping down, right? And so we can start to ask questions, and that starts to flesh out the parts, and we start to then uncover the behaviors and the belief systems and the needs that are built into those.
I'm curious, with people who might just be getting introduced to this modality, I'm just imagining that what might come up for some people is when you ask them, well, what would that part want to say, that might be sort of a difficult, it might be a difficult ask, in the sense that somebody might feel like, well, I'm just making shit up. I'm just telling you something. Is that a process for people of kind of finding, well, where is the intuitive sense of what does this want to say? Because it's a different kind of question to ask someone, like, what does the tightness in your chest want to say? Like,
right.
I don't know. Yeah. So how does that work with people? And do you see kind of that sense of like, oh, is this authentic, or am I making it up, or does it even matter?
So here's the thing. So that does come up occasionally. And so then I get to be curious about, okay, let's step back from your throat, because there's another part here that is in confusion right now, that is feeling like it has to make something up to give me an answer. Let's talk about that part first. And so we just move away from what we call the target part, and we move into, there's another part that's here that's reacting to even the exercise. And then we got to get curious about that first. And so we'll just be like, what's it like to not know? And it's like, is it making you nervous? Is it making you uncomfortable? Like, let's be curious about that first. So we just keep unlayering one above till we get to the one that's having issues. And then we can layer back down again once we've sort of resolved, this is really uncomfortable for me to not know what this says. But, if I can trust that we're in this space together, I can relax a little bit, and then I can sort of soften back into being curious about what's going on in my throat.
Yeah. So by working through these different layers and essentially kind of training people through the process, do you find that it gets easier for clients or patients over time to learn how to use this modality to access this kind of information and speak from that place?
And then they get to be able to start doing it on their own, right? And if they're getting in a conflict with their partner or something like that, and then they can be like, oh, that part of me that really doesn't like it when he does that thing is here right now. And then the next step after that is being able to use parts language in relationships, which I think is really beautiful, because then you get to say, hey, I have a part right now that is really irritated that you keep leaving the knives in the sink. Can we talk about that? And often people, when you use parts language, they'll be like, oh, I can see that that's really bothering you, as opposed to you're leaving the sink, as opposed to embodying that part and being like, you left the knives in the sink again, right? And that's the other person's probably going to respond in a very defensive sort of way.
Right.
And when you get to kind of understand the typical parts that your partners have, you can recognize who they're in and like how to kind of support them, and how you can support yourself when those other parts of them come up. Because typically, when both people are in a part they're probably reacting to something, and then it's not a great time to be interacting with somebody else, and so you got to take care of yourself. So that's
Yeah.
a whole other thing, but it's very cool. There's so many different layers from the interpersonal or the intrapersonal to the interpersonal.
Yeah. So then what happens if somebody comes to you, and I'm asking this because I've had people like this in integration calls that I've done where people tell me, I'm just completely dissociated from my body. I don't feel anything. I don't feel my emotions. I don't feel my body. I just don't feel. What would you advise is what's the next step to take for someone there? And it's like, I don't even fucking know what my parts are because
Sure.
I don't know. And sometimes people describe that as I've always been this way, or sometimes it's been a response to some kind of trauma where they've dissociated from.
Sure.
But where do you start with someone who says, I don't feel anything?
Yeah, I would say, what's that like for you? How are you responding to that? They're like, well, I'm frustrated about it, right? I'm frustrated that I can't feel. Okay, frustration's a feeling. Let's just see where we go with that. And then you can, because you can, often people that say those kinds of things, they're dismissing the things that they do feel.
Right.
And they're saying that they're not feeling anything, but they are feeling something. They're obviously like coming to you because they're feeling either distraught or empty or frustrated or something, right? So you just got to start with where they're at, and that's what's right at the surface.
Yeah, that was some pretty sweet therapeutic jujitsu you did right there. I like that move. So with these different parts, it sounds like they all kind of come with their own narrative. And that sounds kind of interesting. And we could maybe expand and talk about that. And just thinking about how, like in fiction, that's what we're looking for with characters is like, well, the character's got to have a backstory. It's got to have the motivation. They've got to have their habits easily identifiable. Otherwise, then we just say, oh, that's a one-dimensional character, right? It's like,
Right.
not interesting. So it sounds like that this is kind of a natural development of these different characters is to have even their own, quote, backstory.
Totally.
Okay, yeah. So what would you say about that and how that works?
Well, so one of the phrases that I picked up along the way, so I'm not going to take full credit for it, but what is that? Is that so if there's a part that's being sort of like defensive or any of the things, any of the parts that you brought up so far, I'd say when you look outside of yourself, what's the kind of world that you see? And usually the part will be like, people are assholes, like, I can't trust anyone, or, they will show you the world that they live in. I'm like, what's it like living in that world? When did you start living in that world? Well, it was when I was growing up and I had to change schools and everybody was an asshole to me. Oh, okay. So it sounds like this part of you. How old were you when you went to that school and you changed schools? Oh, I was like 13. So you start to see they are still living. Those parts are still living in the place that they had that, some kind of trauma often, or some kind of formative moment. And they're a little bit trapped there. And so they keep using the same behaviors that they did in that moment. And you realize that part's still stuck in, seventh grade or whatever it was when they were 13. And oh, did you get to talk to anybody about how you're feeling at the time? No, my mom didn't have time for me. Right. So you're pulling back to wherever the memories that are associated with this neural network.
So then in helping to understand that story, does that provide the opportunity to do the uncoupling? I don't know if that's the right word,
Sure.
but with the unblending. What is the mechanism through which unblending occurs, and how does that provide potentially transformative relief for people?
Sure. So what we're doing is part of it is gaining a level of trust, because if that part that I was just sort of describing there thinks everybody's an asshole, it's probably trying to figure out, am I an asshole as a therapist?
Yeah.
Right? And am I trustworthy? And so that means then that they're going to be, yeah, wary. And so if I'm being here and being curious about their experience, they're going to soften and they're going to start to trust me more. And then eventually they're going to be able to start to trust their system a little bit more. And so then I can say, hey, it seems like, you've been seeing this worldview, right, like this for a long time. I'm wondering, and it sounds like this younger version of you really needs some support here because they didn't really get support at that time. Would you be open to stepping aside for a little bit so that we can support this younger version of you? And usually that's a yes, or there's maybe some concessions that need to happen, or maybe they're not ready for that yet. But you're we're moving at the speed of trust. And so this is the resistance is the way. So if there's a part that doesn't want to go back to that time because it was painful, we don't go there. That's fine. What are you afraid about going back to that time? Well, it's just overwhelming, all those feelings. Okay, well, if there's a way that we could process some of those feelings in a way that wouldn't be overwhelming, or if it starts to feel overwhelming, maybe you can raise a hand. Would you be okay with us doing that? Because it's really a part of, if we can really help that younger version of you, then you wouldn't need to be quite so rigid around everything. That's been feeling really uncomfortable. So it's being really consent oriented, really helpful, and just not pushing. And if there's a pushback, you get really curious about the pushback. And so we're not wanting parts to behave in certain ways. We're making a space where they feel safe enough where they can unblend.
Yeah. Is it ever the case that someone comes in and they are completely locked into a particular subset within the internal family system where they have so become identified with one of the subsets that they can't even conceive, like, there's this self thing you're talking about that's not this. Like, my whole world is this.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
How does that work?
Yeah, that happens. It tends to be a harder stage of the journey, and as far as their self kind of realization journey is to be able to recognize that that's not all of them, right? And through meditative practices and of other types of practices, people do find that they recognize, oh, there is an observer that is observing, right? And so sometimes when people have those other practices, that can make it a little bit easier for them. But for those, I've had ones where you've been able to be curious about the part of them that is so self-identified. And then other times maybe need a little nudge from a psychedelic assisted experience to be able to give a different perspective.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that was kind of my next question. Is it like, so when do we recommend psychedelics for people? And so you work with ketamine, so that is obviously open and available to you. Yes. But that is kind of an interesting question of when do we recommend the psychedelic experience versus when do we recommend more therapy? You're able to bridge that gap. I was going to say cross that line, but I don't want to make it a line. We can say bridge that gap through offering ketamine experiences. But I'm curious if you have more thoughts about that. As, again, potentially psychedelic therapy becomes more available, more online, or is there ever a point where you say, well, I want to tell you about a program that's up in Oregon, and because I can't refer you to something here in LA, but send you up to Oregon. Just, what are your thoughts there?
Usually it's after people have tried several other things. So, not necessarily to see if they've worked fully, but that they're creating a foundation for themselves. Because I've either helped people integrate it afterwards or made my own mistakes early on where we've jumped too early to those non-ordinary states of consciousness, and people don't even really know how to breathe properly, right? Or like be conscious of their breath, or like be able to notice their thoughts, or just more basic emotional awareness, emotional intelligence skills. And so I tend to work with people that have already done some other types of therapies that didn't really work for them per se all the way, but it laid a groundwork, because then we can start to be like, okay, now I can see where you're stuck. You have language to be able to talk about where you're stuck. Because if there's no language, then how are you supposed to even like identify what's happening? And it creates so many more problems on the back end in the integration process if you don't have the foundation beforehand. And so for safety reasons and just for ease reasons, I encourage people to either some meditative practices or self-reflection practices. It doesn't necessarily have to be therapy per se, but therapy is helpful too.
So I just wanted to say that I really appreciate that, especially coming from as a therapist, kind of recommending, well, let's look at these other basic foundational modalities first, and then we'll consider when we want to get to psychedelic therapy. So, yeah, with the book itself, I was really curious to ask, what was the motivation by making it accessible through the illustrations and kind of presenting it that way, and in a sense, making it simplistic, easily accessible. But how did you decide? Like, I want to make like a cartoon or a comic strip style approach to IFS.
Yeah. So it's a picture book. And so part of it was when I first started implementing IFS with clients, I found that I was taking like several sessions just explaining the model, or I would try to recommend at the time they didn't have a lot of books for clients to explain it. Now there's a better one. It's called No Bad Parts. It's by Richard Schwartz. It's great, but it's a full book. And some people don't read books.
Yeah.
Or they don't have time, and it just doesn't happen. And so my intention was to make a easy picture book that anybody could pick up. It takes like 20 to 30 minutes to read if you're really sitting there and kind of digesting and doing some of the exercises. And it gets people the whole framework, and then we can hit the ground running, and I'm not spending all this time in therapy just trying to answer people's questions about it. And so that's the tool here. So I wanted that tool for myself. And so then I thought that would be useful for other therapists as well. And so far, I've been getting good feedback around it.
Yeah, well, it's very accessible, and for me, like I said, that it's been coming up a lot with clients, but I'm not really educated on IFS. I knew the basic idea, but then going through the book, it's like, oh yeah, this all makes sense. I can see how this works for people, and it's presented in a way that's very clear and very accessible. And I think it's smart with. All the data says young people, they don't read books anymore. And so as these generations continue to come up, that having things that are accessible in this way, I think is significant.
Yeah. And I mean, I originally organized all of the artwork to be in a square format to be able to put on Instagram and to put and so I plan to still be putting more little vignettes that didn't really make it into the book into artwork that will show up on the Instagram. And I've got other ideas for further books that in the same theme, because it's been so much fun making this and following the little characters and just my own musings as I've gone through the whole process. So, and I'll explain so that the whole metaphor in the book is that the parts are depicted as little clouds.
Yeah.
And the self is depicted as a sun. And so, which was a metaphor that has popped up in the IFS community before, but it really lent itself really beautifully to these little cute cartoon characters. And so when you're covered, you're fully blended, you just have parts all over you, and you there's no sunshine getting through. And then as you start to, like the clouds, as the parts start to move away, then you start to have your self energy be able to come through. So all these little weather references are really cute and move through the whole thing.
And what did you use to make the illustrations for the book?
I used Procreate on my iPad. So it's all digital, and it's been really fun to learn different techniques. And I've been an artist in various different forms for my whole life. And so getting the iPad in the last few years has just really opened up a whole new medium for me to do digital collage and just yeah, artwork in a way that it's harder to do with traditional mediums.
Yeah. Did you go through like different stylistic versions, or how did you settle on the look like what you've just described here with like the clouds and the sunny
Yeah.
stuff? And
Well, I think I had this is kind of funny, but I had found out that in Procreate they have a halftone filter, which makes everything look like newspaper print cartoons, and I just thought that was so cute. And so I was like, oh, it'd be really cute to make the cartoons be like as if it was like drawn as an old newspaper cartoon. And
yeah,
so I wanted to make it feel like the texture of that. And so that's the feel of it is like newspaper cartoons, but they're all colored. So,
yeah.
um, yeah.
And now you've got the hard copy of the book. So is that how it's going to be available? Is in this hardcover version? Is it going to be a paperback? Is there going to be an ebook? Are there
hmm
these things?
Yeah, it's going to be a hardback and a digital one. I kind of imagined that maybe therapists or other people that want to have the book like so that they can show their clients, maybe if they come to an office, not many people are going in an office these days, but to have something that they can read on the spot. But I thought that maybe the digital version was actually going to be the most popular because once they read through the book, they don't necessarily need to read through it again, right? So they could read the digital copy very quickly on their device, and then they're off to the races. They don't have to wait for anything to arrive, anything like that. So, so there's a hard count copy if you really want that, and it is fun to have. But I think for therapists to be able to recommend to their clients, it'll probably be just being able to send the link to the Kindle version. They can download it on the spot. They can read it in 20 minutes, and they got the whole framework ready to go for their next session. So
Yeah.
trying to make
And
it really easy.
yeah, and you're imagining also that this could be used by people who maybe aren't even working with a therapist, but want to maybe
Sure.
start to apply some of these tools for themselves. And
Totally, totally. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's for a lay audience. I tried to make it accessible enough for a lay audience to understand the concepts and be able to start to use them on their own. You're maybe not going to get to like the deeper layers of the healing part, but you're at least going to be able to start to understand who's showing up in your system
yeah,
and
have you
what your
worked
needs
with
are.
yeah, have you worked with people after getting introduced to this where they come back and it's like, wow, this has really revolutionized how I even think and conceive of myself and
Mm-hmm.
experience myself?
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah, I had it was so moving. I had one woman, she had tried to learn IFS at some other context, and then I gave her the book, an early copy of the book to read, and I was with her at the time, and she just starts crying as she's reading the book, and she related it to it so much, and it was just like the best compliment that I could have received was to be able to see her being so moved by it because it just felt like it was really speaking to something for her. So that was really wonderful.
Wow, that's awesome. So where can people find the book? Let's remind them of the title again.
Yeah, the title is Quieting the Storm Within, an illustrated introduction to your parts through internal family systems and beyond. But if you just look up Quieting the Storm Within on Amazon, that's going to be the main place to be able to buy it. If you don't like Amazon, you can also buy it through Pezi Publishing, Pesi. That's my publisher. And my website, which has a link to where you can buy the book, is ifsandbeyond.com. And on there, I've got some little freebie worksheets and some swag. I made these cute little mugs that have like the characters on them.
Hmm.
And so I'm showing Martin right now if you're not being able to see it, but they just have like the characters on you that remind you of little sweet things that the book helps you point you to.
Nice.
So there's stickers and journaling exercises and all sorts of other things. So that's another fun place to check it out. And our Instagram is also IFS and beyond.
All right. Well, there will be links available
Yes.
for listeners in the podcast notes and description. I know you got another call coming up, so I do want to let you go so you have a little run time to get there for that. But is there anything else that I didn't ask about that you want to mention before we sign off or anything else?
Mm. I just that I hope that through this book that people will be able to have something, and it makes it a little bit more easy for them to be able to access their self and that deeper essence that's inside them. Because when you find and get access to that, something really magical happens. And I wish that for anybody.
Mm. All right. Well, thanks so much for your time today, Ashley.
You're
And thank you so
welcome.
much for reaching out. It's been a super great pleasure to have you back on the podcast. And it's just
Yeah.
exciting to kind of touch base with you. It's definitely been a few years since I've seen you. And it's a pleasure to have you on to help shed some light on this IFS stuff for all of us who maybe didn't know. So thank you so much. Really
Yeah,
appreciate
my
it.
pleasure.